Hey, Lakeland folks, welcome to Hymns of Hope and Comfort. I hope that you will enjoy our little devotional time together this fine day. I want to look this week at a hymn that we did this past Sunday called "Guide Me, O Thou Great Jehovah." Really fine tune, one that folks know all over the place. You can find some interesting links in the description under the video for a traditional version of that and for a modern folk version of that. I wanted to begin, though, asking you this question. Have you ever felt anxious because you don't know what the future holds? You don't know what's coming next. Well, most of us feel that way once in a while, and many of us have felt the cruel sting of uncertainty lately, especially surrounding this pandemic and the economic difficulties that it has brought to many. We're out here slogging away in a dangerous world full of conflict. We may feel put upon, occasionally beat down, worried that our deal might fall through or that my job might not be here tomorrow. And granted, some of us feel that way more often than others, but every one of us is susceptible to that kind of anxiety and fear from time to time. It's helpful to know that Moses felt that way a long time ago, and we can relate to him today. I want you to think for a minute back with me to the events of the Exodus. The book of Exodus opens with Israel in slavery down in Egypt, and God raises up someone to deliver them. You know who it is. It's Moses, and you know his story. He was raised in Pharaoh's palace for the first 40 years of his life. He came to the aid of his fellow Hebrews and killed a guy and spent the next 40 years in exile out in Midian. Then God appeared to Moses in a burning bush and told him to go back to Egypt to deliver Israel out. Well, scared and nervous, Moses comes back to his childhood friend, now the Pharaoh, and he demands for the Israelites to be released. You remember what happens next. In modern day terminology, Pharaoh snorts out this indignant and sarcastic, "Yeah, right." And then it's on between Moses and Pharaoh, between Israel and Egypt. Would God deliver them from slavery and from Egypt? Of course, we know that he did, but Moses didn't have the benefit of being able to look backwards like we do. He was in the anxiety-filled position of an unknown future. And he was put in a position to depend on God to be faithful to his promises. The hymn, "Guide Me, O Thou Great Jehovah," is almost entirely drawn from Bible imagery, particularly the Exodus story. The hymn compares the 40-plus year trek of the Israelites from Egypt to the Promised Land with our living of the Christian life as pilgrims through this barren land. So this hymn is an allegory comparing the journey of the Christian throughout his or her life here on earth, requiring the Redeemer's guidance and ending at the gates of heaven on the verge of Jordan. And at the end of time, death of death and hell's destruction, it parallels and compares the Christian life to the exodus of Israel out of Egypt. And it is a prayer, a request for God's divine help and guidance. Now, God's guidance as he delivers his people becomes apparent in the Exodus story and in this hymn in 5 comforting and hope-filled realities. First, we always have God's presence. We left off with Moses in conflict with Pharaoh. Well, you know what happened next. 10 plagues are called down on the Egyptians, with the final one being the death of the firstborn. You remember how God made a way for everyone who believed in him to be passed over. They were to put the blood of a sacrificial lamb, the Passover lamb, on their doorposts. And obviously, even that points forward to Christ, our ultimate Passover lamb. Only at this point, though, does Pharaoh decide to let Israel leave. He had to go through all 10 plagues. In Exodus 12, the Egyptians, it says, urgently sent them away. They were tired of all the bad stuff happening to them. But you already know that Pharaoh had a change of heart. Soon after he was sorry that he'd said that to them, and he sent his army to chase them, to chase the Israelites. And they caught up to them just before they got to the Red Sea. They cornered the Israelites without any help, or so the Egyptians thought. But in Exodus 13, verse 21, we read, "The Lord went before them by day in a pillar of cloud to lead them along the way, and by night in a pillar of fire to give them light, that they might travel by day and by night. The pillar of cloud by day and the pillar of fire by night did not depart before the people." So like the Israelites, first of all, we can expect God's presence as he delivers us and guides us. God is with us. Check out verse 2 of the hymn. "Let that fiery, cloudy pillar lead me all my journey through." No doubt about where that idea comes from. It comes from right here in Exodus 13. Proclaiming that God's presence is with his people. Secondly, as Israel found, we have God's protection as he delivers us and guides us. "Strong deliverer" is the phrase that follows this in the hymn. If you remember the story, this is what God proves himself to be, a strong deliverer. When he opens up the Red Sea, the Israelites pass through on dry land, and after they pass through, then he drowns Pharaoh's army with all of that walled up water. But not only is God's guidance and redemption all about his presence and his protection, thirdly, we find that we have God's power as he guides and delivers us. The story isn't done. After the Hebrews cross the Red Sea, they find themselves out in the wilderness. It's called the wilderness of sin, where they will spend the next 40 years. That's when they really need to remember that God's power is on their side. Verse 1 of the hymn, "Guide me, O thou great Jehovah, pilgrim through this barren land. I am weak, but thou art mighty. Hold me with thy powerful hand." What God did continually in their midst was show his power, holding back the sea, killing the whole Egyptian army, bringing destruction and death through the plagues. This is a powerful God. So we find in the hymn and the Exodus story that we can rely on God's power as he guides us through this life and delivers us from slavery to sin and the destruction sin brings. But God is not content to only give us his presence, his protection, and his power. In Exodus 16, we discover that God gives us his provision as he guides and delivers us. Verse 1 of the hymn, toward the end, it says, bread of heaven, feed me till I want no more." The Israelites are out in the wilderness and they're grumbling about the Lord bringing them out of Egypt. And Moses tells Aaron, "Gather up these grumbling people." And then the glory of the Lord appeared before them all in a cloud. Exodus 16:12 says, "I have heard the grumbling of the people of Israel. Say to them, at twilight you shall eat meat, and in the morning you will be filled with bread. Then you shall know that I am the Lord your God." In the evening, quail came up and covered the camp, and in the morning, dew lay around the camp. And when the dew had gone, there was a fine flake-like thing, fine as frost on the ground. When the people of Israel saw it, they said to one another, "What is it?" For they did not know what it was. And Moses said to them, "It's the manna, it's the bread that the Lord has given you to eat." So when God is guiding and delivering you, you can trust him to provide for you. Just as the Israelites received manna and quail, God will meet your daily needs. In fact, in the Gospel of John, Jesus declares that he is the bread of life. So more than just satisfying physical needs, Jesus is the fulfillment of all your spiritual wants as well. Well, the story goes on, as does the song. "Open now the crystal fountain." And that's a reference to Exodus chapter 17. The nation of Israel was in the desert, and now they had bread, but no water. So they started to, guess what? They started to grumble again. They blamed Moses. They blamed the Lord. They asked Moses, "Did you bring us out in the desert to die of thirst? Give us some water." They were about ready to kill Moses. But in Exodus chapter 17, verse 5, it says, "The Lord said to Moses, pass on before the people, take some of the elders of Israel, and take in your hand the staff with which you struck the Nile, and go. Behold, I will stand before you there on the rock at Horeb, and you shall strike the rock, and water shall come out of it, and the people will drink. And Moses did this in the sight of the elders of Israel. So God used Moses to produce water from a rock. And the New Testament tells us explicitly that the rock was Jesus. He is the source of all we need, the true bread come down from heaven, and the spring of living water, which is our life. So after being guided by a cloud by day and a fire by night to their final arrival 40 years later in the Promised Land, we find that over in Joshua, Israel realized that God was the one who not only gave them all of those other things, but in the end, he gives them one last thing. He gives them his peace. So that verse in the hymn says, "When I tread the verge of Jordan, passing over the Jordan River, bid my anxious fears subside, death of death and hell's destruction. Land me safe on Canaan's side, and songs of praises I will ever sing to thee." So Israel, under Joshua's leadership, did cross over into the Promised Land and possess it. At the end of Joshua's life, listen to this description of what had happened. Now, in Joshua chapter 24, verses 6 through 13, you can find a whole story of the conquest, the coming out of Egypt and the conquest. But 24:13 says, "I gave you a land on which you had not labored, and cities that you had not built, and you dwell in them. You eat the fruit of vineyards and olive orchards that you never planted." That is a description of a people now at peace and enjoying the blessings of God. Bid my anxious fears subside, the hymn says, because we know that God delivered and blessed and guided his people long ago. We can be sure that he will do the same for us through Jesus Christ our Savior. We can know and enjoy God's peace. So this Exodus story is a signpost for us Christians. It points us forward to the ultimate strong deliverer, Jesus Christ, leading us out of sin and into heavenly eternal paradise, the true promised land. Moses and Israel were a microcosm of a greater thing to come. They were types of Jesus and the complete and full redemption that he brings to his people. That's why the author of this hymn, William Williams, found the Exodus story to be such a good description of the Christian life. Pilgrims being delivered from sin into the ultimate promised land. In life, we need a deliverer, one who will guide us when we have no idea what is coming next. So when we need God's power, his presence, his provision, his protection, and his peace, we can rely on this truth. Our great God, through Jesus Christ, is there with us every step of the way, delivering us from sin and guiding us to the heavenly promised land. Now may God bless you richly, and I hope that we will see you next time.